Story 1. It was a cold, foggy night. The kind of night where the world feels empty and the silence wraps around you like a heavy blanket. The clock on the dashboard blinked 2:07 a.m. The road ahead was a straight line of nothingness, stretching endlessly into the fog. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the car engine, interrupted now and then by the faint crackle of static from the old radio. There wasn't another car in sight. As the driver glanced in the rear-view mirror, a shadow flickered in the distance. At first it seemed like a trick of the fog, but then it became clearer, a figure standing on the side of the road. They were waving, their arm moving desperately in the dim light of the car's high beams. The driver's stomach tightened. Who could possibly be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? For a moment they considered driving past, pretending not to see. But as they got closer, the figure's outline sharpened. A slender woman, drenched as if she'd been walking in the rain. Her hair clung to her face, and her clothes hung heavily on her frame. Something about her seemed off, but her frantic waving made it impossible to ignore. The car slowed, the driver's heart pounding louder than the engine. As they pulled over to the shoulder, the figure stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She leaned down toward the passenger window, her eyes shadowed beneath the wet strands of her hair. The driver hesitated, their hand hovering over the lock. Everything inside screamed to keep driving, but they rolled the window down just enough to hear her speak. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Please," she said, her lips trembling. "I need help." The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. Against their better judgment, they unlocked the doors and motioned for her to get in. As she slid into the back seat, the air inside the car turned icy cold. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, but her face was obscured by the darkness and her dripping hair. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and gave vague directions to a town further down the road. The driver nodded, forcing their eyes back to the fog-covered highway. Something wasn't right, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They shifted in their seat, trying to ignore the growing unease that crept up their spine. The figure sat motionless in the back, clutching something tightly against her chest. The journey continued in silence, but the driver couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was about to take a very dark turn. The highway stretched on, a never-ending ribbon of fog and shadows. The woman in the back seat didn't say much, only giving short answers when asked about where she needed to go. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear over the hum of the engine. She clutched a small, weathered journal to her chest, her pale fingers gripping it tightly, as if letting go would cost her something far greater than its worth. The driver's unease grew with every passing mile. The air inside the car felt different now, heavier, colder. They adjusted the heater, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The rearview mirror offered little reassurance. The woman sat still, her face obscured by her damp hair, her gaze fixed on something far away, something the driver couldn't see. "Where did you come from?" the driver asked, their voice breaking the tense silence. The woman didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her words were slow and deliberate, like they carried a weight too heavy to bear. "Just further down the road," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter anymore." The driver frowned, their grip tightening on the wheel. There was something strange about the way she said it, as if the words themselves were a clue they couldn't quite decipher. They wanted to ask more, to press her for details, but the icy atmosphere made it hard to think clearly. Instead, they kept driving, the road ahead disappearing into the fog as quickly as it appeared. Then, out of the corner of their eye, the driver noticed something. The rear-view mirror flickered just for a second. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light or the fog playing games with their mind. But when they looked again, they saw her reflection. It wasn't quite right. Her face looked distorted, like an image in a broken mirror, the edges of her features shifting unnaturally. They blinked, and it was gone, replaced by her still and silent form. The unease became a knot in the pit of their stomach. Something was wrong, but the driver couldn't figure out what. As they turned their focus back to the road, the woman shifted in her seat for the first time. Her movements were slow, almost robotic. She dropped the journal onto the floor, and it landed with a muffled thud. Without thinking, the driver glanced down at it. The journal lay open, its pages filled with strange, dark sketches. The first drawing showed the highway they were driving on, eerily accurate in every detail. The second page was worse, a car engulfed in flames, the outline of a figure trapped inside. "Is everything okay back there?" the driver asked, their voice shaking slightly. They didn't turn around. They didn't want to see her face again. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her presence suddenly much closer, much colder. The driver felt her breath, faint and icy, brushing against their neck. "Do you believe in second chances?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel, their heart pounding in their chest. They didn't answer. They couldn't. The air was too thick, the weight of her words pressing down like a heavy stone. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a simple ride anymore. Something far darker was sitting in the back seat. The car sped along the endless highway, the fog swallowing everything outside the faint glow of the headlights. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering slightly as though moved by an unseen breeze. The driver's eyes darted nervously to the rear-view mirror, where the woman sat motionless again, her gaze cast downward, her face hidden by her dripping hair. "You missed the turn," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the thick silence. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. "What turn?" they asked, their voice strained. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly raised her head, revealing a pale, expressionless face. "The one back there," she murmured, gesturing vaguely behind them. The driver's stomach dropped. They hadn't seen any turn, no sign, no exit, nothing but the same unending road. "I didn't see it," they said, their voice faltering. "It's okay," she replied softly. "There's another one ahead." The words sent a chill racing down their spine. How did she know? The GPS had been silent, its screen now showing nothing but a black void. The driver stole another glance at the journal on the floor. One of the sketches had changed. The once burning car was now twisted metal on a deserted road, the faint outline of a figure standing beside it. The air in the car grew heavier, and a faint buzzing sound filled the space, growing louder and louder. The driver turned the radio dial instinctively, but it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from her. Her lips moved, but no words came out, just that low, eerie buzz. "Are you all right?" the driver asked, their voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she pointed a pale finger toward the windshield. "There," she said. Ahead, through the thick fog, dim lights flickered. It looked like the outline of another car, its hazard lights blinking erratically on the side of the road. Relief flooded the driver. Someone else was out here. Maybe they could help. But as the car drew closer, the relief turned to dread. The vehicle was a mangled wreck, its frame twisted and charred, its windows shattered. The blinking hazard lights seemed impossibly bright, casting an unnatural glow that flickered like fire. The driver slowed, unable to look away from the wreckage. They felt the woman lean forward again, her presence cold and heavy. "This is where it happened," she whispered, her voice a breath against their ear. The driver froze. "What happened?" they asked, barely able to get the words out. There was no answer. When they glanced in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. The coldness lingered, and the buzzing grew louder, filling the car like a swarm of unseen insects. The driver's gaze snapped back to the road, but the wreckage was gone. The hazard lights, the mangled car, all of it had vanished. Only the fog remained, thick and suffocating. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. They were completely alone. or so they thought. The buzzing stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, almost inaudible laugh. It came from the back seat. The driver didn't dare look, their knuckles white as they gripped the wheel. They pushed the car faster, desperate to outrun whatever horror they'd picked up on this cursed road, but the voice returned, closer now. "You didn't stop for me before," she said, her tone colder than ice. "You just drove past." The driver's heart felt like it might burst. "I don't know what you're talking about," they stammered, their voice cracking. "You left me there," she hissed, her voice now filled with venom. "And now I've come back for you." The road ahead seemed endless, the fog growing darker, heavier, as if the night itself was swallowing them whole. The driver knew one thing for certain: they couldn't escape. Not anymore. The car was moving faster now, the speedometer needle creeping toward dangerous numbers. The driver's breath came in shallow gasps, their heart pounding like a drum. Every instinct screamed to keep driving, to outrun the terror sitting in the back seat. But deep down they knew it was futile. The woman's voice echoed through the car, soft but sharp, like a whisper carried on a blade. "Do you think you can leave me behind? Do you think it's that easy?" The driver risked a glance in the rearview mirror and their blood ran cold. She was no longer sitting passively. Her face was now fully visible, illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Her once hidden features were grotesque, her skin marred by burns and cuts, her eyes hollow and filled with rage. The driver slammed the accelerator, their focus locked on the foggy road ahead. The car seemed to scream in protest, the engine roaring as they pushed it to its limits. The woman laughed, a sound that made the air in the car feel like it was being sucked away. "Faster," she urged, her voice dripping with mockery. "Let's see how far you can go." The fog began to shift and swirl, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. Shadows darted across the road, and the headlights flickered, threatening to plunge the driver into total darkness. The journal on the floor began to slide back and forth with the motion of the car. Its pages flipped wildly, landing on a new drawing. The driver couldn't help but glance down. It was a chillingly familiar image. A car skidding off the road, tumbling into a ditch. Their car. "No," the driver muttered, their voice trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The woman's laughter grew louder, filling every corner of the car. "It's very real," she hissed, "just like it was for me." Suddenly, the road ahead disappeared. The fog thickened into a solid wall, and before the driver could react, the car slammed into it. The impact wasn't physical. It was something else, something impossible. The car stopped dead, but the driver felt as though they were falling, spiraling into an endless void. The woman leaned forward, her face inches from theirs. Her eyes burned with unnatural light, her voice low and menacing. "Do you know what it feels like to be forgotten, to be left behind? I'll show you." The dashboard lights flickered and died. The fog seeped into the car like a living thing, wrapping around the driver's arms and legs, pulling them backward. They screamed, clawing at the wheel, but it was no use. The woman was the last thing they saw before everything went black. Her face twisted into a chilling smile as she whispered, "Now you'll know what it's like." When the fog cleared, the car sat abandoned on the side of the road, its engine silent. There was no sign of the driver, no sign of the woman. Only the journal remained, sitting open on the passenger seat. The final page was blank, save for a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting: "She never lets go." The highway returned to its haunting silence. The fog lingered like a veil, and the car sat empty on the side of the road, its headlights dimming until they flickered out entirely. For hours, nothing moved, not a sound, not a shadow. The world seemed frozen in the eerie stillness of the night. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the haze, A passing truck slowed as it neared the car. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, pulled over cautiously. He honked twice, but there was no response. The car door was slightly ajar, and a faint chill seemed to seep from within. Curiosity, or perhaps a sense of duty, pushed him to step out. As he approached, his boots crunched against the gravel, each step feeling heavier than the last. Peering inside, he saw nothing but an empty driver's seat and an old journal lying open on the passenger seat. The man reached in, flipping through the pages. His brows furrowed as he scanned the eerie sketches, his hands trembling slightly. The last page caught his attention. The single sentence written there made his blood run cold. She never lets go. The man looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was. Too quiet. He stepped back, intending to leave, but as he turned toward his truck, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a laugh. A soft, chilling laugh that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. His head snapped back to the car, but it was empty. The journal lay closed now, though he hadn't touched it. The man climbed back into his truck, his hand shaking as he gripped the wheel. He started the engine, but just as he began to pull away, he glanced into his rearview mirror. There, in the back seat of his truck, sat the woman. Her pale face stared back at him, her hollow eyes unblinking. The journal was now in her hands. She held it tightly, as if it were a part of her. Slowly, she raised her head and met his terrified gaze. Her lips curled into a smile, and her voice whispered faintly, "It's your turn now." The truck swerved violently as the man's scream was swallowed by the rising fog. When the mist cleared, both the car and the truck were gone, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of road and a chilling silence. And somewhere, deep in the fog, the journal waited for its next passenger. Story 2. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cloaked in darkness and silence. It was past 3 in the morning, and the only sound was the low hum of the car engine and the occasional chirp of static from the radio. The driver, exhausted from a long night shift, glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:15 a.m. Just 2 more exits to go before home. They sighed, adjusting their grip on the steering wheel, hoping to stay alert. The highway was completely deserted. Not a single car had passed by in over 20 minutes. The headlights cut through the thick blackness, revealing nothing but the yellow stripes of the road and the occasional road sign. Then, in the rearview mirror, something caught their eye. A faint pair of headlights in the distance, barely visible through the gloom. At first, the driver didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else was finally making their way down this lonely stretch of road. But as the headlights grew closer, an uneasy feeling began to settle in their chest. The car behind them wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was keeping pace, following at just the right distance to stay in the driver's mirror. The driver adjusted the rearview mirror, squinting to get a better look. The car's headlights glared back, too bright to see the make or model. "Weird," they muttered under their breath. No matter how fast or slow they went, the car matched their every move, like a shadow that refused to fall behind. The first twinge of fear crept in as they switched lanes to see if the other car would pass. Instead, it followed, switching lanes with them. The road stretched on, but now it felt tighter, like the darkness was closing in. A cold sweat formed on their brow. Something wasn't right. Something about that car didn't feel normal. The driver's hand tightened on the wheel, their foot pressing harder on the gas. They didn't want to look in the mirror again, but they couldn't help themselves. The headlights behind them were closer now, glaring brighter than before, like eyes burning through the darkness. The feeling in their gut was undeniable. This was no ordinary car. The headlights behind the driver stayed unnervingly close, refusing to back off or pass. Every time they glanced in the rearview mirror, their unease grew. The car didn't just follow, it mirrored their every move with unsettling precision. If the driver sped up, so did the car. If they slowed down, The car did too, always keeping the same haunting distance. "What do you want?" the driver muttered, their voice shaky in the emptiness of the car. They flicked on their turn signal and moved into the right lane, hoping the strange car would pass. But it didn't. It followed, its headlights unwavering, locked onto them like a predator stalking its prey. The driver felt the tension in their chest tighten. They took a deep breath and decided to test something. They eased up on the accelerator and began to slow, their speedometer dropping to 40. The car behind them slowed as well, its headlights glaring brighter, almost taunting them. They pressed the gas again, speeding back up to 70. The car followed without hesitation, as though tied to them by some invisible thread. Now, the driver's nerves were fraying. They turned off the radio, the silence in the car amplifying the pounding of their heart. Something about the other car felt wrong, too deliberate, too calculated. It wasn't just following them, it was watching them. Curiosity mixed with fear, and the driver found themselves glancing into the rearview mirror again. This time they squinted, trying to make out the driver of the car. That's when their stomach dropped. The headlights glared brightly, but beyond them, in the shadows of the windshield, there was nothing. No outline of a driver, no movement, just emptiness. A chill ran down the driver's spine. "That's not possible," they whispered, their voice trembling. They gripped the steering wheel tighter, their mind racing. Maybe the darkness was playing tricks on them. Maybe the angle of the headlights made it hard to see. But deep down, they knew better. The car was moving, its headlights burning, its tires gripping the road, yet it was empty. No one was driving it. The driver's pulse quickened. They needed to get away, needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and that car. They scanned the highway for an exit, any way to escape this nightmare. But all they could see was the endless road ahead and the blinding headlights behind them. The driver's breathing grew shallow as they pressed harder on the gas, pushing the car to speeds they rarely dared on the deserted highway. The needle on the speedometer crept past 80, yet the car behind them stayed locked in place, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror like a pair of watchful eyes. "Come on, just go around," the driver muttered, desperation creeping into their voice. They swerved into the left lane, hoping to throw the other car off. But the car followed immediately, its movements eerily smooth, as if it anticipated their every action. The radio crackled to life suddenly, making the driver jump. It wasn't music or a station, just static, mixed with faint, unintelligible whispers. The driver instinctively reached for the dial, but no matter how much they turned it, the sound wouldn't stop. It grew louder, filling the small car with a strange, oppressive noise that seemed to claw at their mind. "Stop it!" the driver yelled, slapping the radio off. The static disappeared, leaving behind a suffocating silence that was somehow worse. But the relief was short-lived. The headlights behind them began to flicker, dimming and brightening in an unsettling rhythm. It was almost as if the car were communicating. The driver's hands shook as they gripped the wheel. Their knuckles turned white, their palms slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed at them to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The highway stretched on endlessly, an unbroken line of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. They risked another glance in the mirror, hoping against hope that the car was finally gone. Instead, they saw something worse. The space behind the blinding headlights wasn't empty anymore. A shadowy figure sat in the driver's seat, its features obscured but unmistakably human, or almost human. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, watching, its presence more menacing than the headlights that pierced the darkness. The driver's pulse raced as they tore their eyes away, focusing on the road ahead. Their mind raced, grasping for some explanation, but none of it made sense. A sudden jolt shook the car, snapping them back to reality. The car behind them had bumped their rear bumper, not hard enough to spin them out, but enough to send a clear message. The driver screamed, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared as the car surged forward, but the other car kept pace, closing the gap. "Leave me alone," they shouted, their voice cracking with panic. The car ahead was just a dark blur in the fog now, and for a moment they thought they might have lost it. But then the headlights reappeared, not behind them this time, but directly in front of them, blinding and impossibly close. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. The headlights vanished, leaving the highway in total darkness. The driver sat frozen, their chest heaving as they tried to catch their breath. Then, from the corner of their eye, they saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the side of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but its presence was enough to chill them to the bone. The driver's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as they stared at the shadowy figure on the side of the road. Its glowing eyes cut through the darkness, unblinking and fixed directly on them. Every instinct screamed at them to move, to drive, to get away, but their hands felt glued to the steering wheel. Then, the figure stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost predatory. It didn't walk like a person. Its motions were unnaturally smooth, as if it were gliding across the ground. The driver's heart pounded in their chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the suffocating silence of the night. "No, no, no, no," they whispered, their voice trembling. They fumbled with the gear shift, trying to restart the car. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Relief surged through them, but it was short-lived. As they glanced up, the figure was no longer on the side of the road. It was standing in front of the car. The driver screamed, slamming the car into reverse and flooring the pedal. The car jerked backward, the tires screeching against the asphalt. For a brief moment, they thought they might escape. But then, from the darkness, the headlights of the other car appeared again, this time rushing toward them at an impossible speed. The driver spun the wheel, veering off the road and into the gravel shoulder. The ghostly car barreled past them, disappearing into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared. Shaking, the driver steadied the car and pulled back onto the road, their hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. But the nightmare wasn't over. A sound, a low guttural whisper, filled the car, sending chills racing down their spine. "You can't outrun me," the voice hissed, echoing in the small space. Terrified, the driver turned to look in the rearview mirror. Their blood froze. The shadowy figure was now sitting in the back seat, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. It leaned forward slowly, its presence heavy and suffocating. "You left me behind once," it whispered, its voice cold and filled with malice. "Now I'm here to stay." The driver's scream filled the car as they stomped on the gas, the car lurching forward into the fog. But no matter how fast they drove, the figure didn't move. It remained there, silent and unyielding, its eyes a constant reminder that escape was impossible. The car sped down the empty highway, the fog swallowing everything beyond the reach of the headlights. The driver's hands trembled on the wheel, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure in the back seat remained motionless, its glowing eyes reflecting in the rearview mirror like two burning coals. It didn't speak again, but its presence was suffocating, pressing down on the driver like an unbearable weight. "I didn't do anything," the driver whispered, their voice shaking. "I didn't leave you behind. I don't even know you." The figure didn't respond. It simply stared, unblinking as if waiting for something. The driver's foot pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. Trees and road signs blurred into streaks of gray as the car roared forward, but the fog seemed endless, the road stretching on forever. Then, without warning, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand and pointed forward. The driver's eyes snapped to the road, and their stomach dropped. Just ahead, faint in the fog, was the outline of another car. A mangled wreck sprawled across the middle of the highway, Its hazard lights blinked erratically, casting eerie, stuttering flashes of red onto the road. The driver slammed on the brakes, the car skidding wildly, but it was too late. The impact never came. Instead, the driver's car passed straight through the wreckage as if it were nothing more than a mirage. The air inside the car grew icy cold, and the driver gasped, their breath visible in the freezing air. They looked in the rearview mirror again, but the figure was gone. The back seat was empty. Relief washed over them, but it didn't last. As they tried to steady their breathing, the radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't static. It was a voice, soft, whispering, and unmistakably the same one from before. "You'll never be alone," it said, the words sending a chill down the driver's spine. "I'm always here." The driver's heart pounded as they reached for the radio, desperate to shut it off. But as their hand moved, they caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, something that made their blood turn to ice. The glowing eyes were back, staring at them from the darkness just beyond the rear window. The car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. The driver's grip tightened on the wheel, their eyes locked on the road ahead. The fog seemed thicker now, almost alive, swirling around the car like a living thing. The headlights dimmed further, and the radio grew louder, the whispers overlapping until they became an incoherent cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the car engine died. The lights went out, leaving the driver in total darkness. They sat frozen, their breath loud in the silence, their hands shaking on the wheel. In the suffocating blackness, a soft voice spoke, close to their ear. "Drive all you want," it whispered. "You'll never leave me behind." The story ends with the faint glow of two headlights in the distance, growing brighter and brighter, until they consume everything. Then there's nothing but silence and the endless, haunting fog. Story 3. The hum of the taxi engine filled the quiet night as the driver navigated the empty streets. The city was behind them now, its bright lights fading into the rearview mirror. Ahead lay the outskirts, a stretch of quiet, shadowy roads that rarely saw traffic at this hour. It was nearing 3 a.m, and the driver's eyes were heavy, their mind already on getting home after one last fare. The dashboard clock blinked, its numbers glowing faintly in the dim cabin. The driver yawned, glancing at the empty back seat through the mirror. Business had been slow all night, and they debated heading back to the garage when something caught their eye. A figure on the side of the road, raising a hand for a ride. The driver slowed instinctively, squinting to get a better look. The figure stood under a broken streetlight, their face obscured by the shadows. They wore a dark hoodie pulled low over their head, their posture still, almost unnaturally so. The driver hesitated, their fingers hovering over the door lock. It wasn't unusual for people to flag down cabs this far out, but something about this person felt off. A low sigh escaped the driver's lips as they finally unlocked the doors. A fare was a fare, and they could use the money. The back door opened with a quiet click, and the figure climbed in, their movements slow and deliberate. They sat in the middle of the back seat, silent, their hood pulled low over their face. "Where to?" the driver asked, trying to sound casual. The passenger tilted their head slightly, their voice soft and monotone. "Just drive." The driver frowned, glancing at the mirror again. The passenger didn't look up, their hands resting motionless on their lap. "You gotta give me a direction," the driver pressed. "Just keep going," the passenger said, their tone flat. The driver shrugged uneasily and pulled back onto the road. The air inside the taxi felt heavier now, as if the presence of the silent passenger had soaked up all the warmth. They adjusted the heater, but the chill remained. The quiet stretched between them, broken only by the faint rattle of the meter ticking up. As the city lights disappeared completely and the road grew darker, the driver couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake. The taxi rolled down the dark, deserted road, its headlights barely piercing the dense shadows that seemed to grow thicker with each passing mile. The driver stole a glance at the passenger in the rearview mirror. They sat perfectly still, their face hidden under the shadow of their hood, their hands resting unnervingly motionless on their knees. The driver's unease grew with every second of silence. "You sure you don't have an address?" the driver asked, forcing a lightness into their voice that they didn't feel. "I can't just drive forever." "Keep going," the passenger replied, their voice soft but cold, like the whisper of wind through an empty house. The driver swallowed hard and kept their eyes on the road. The passenger's presence was unsettling, their silence filling the small space of the car with an oppressive weight. The driver flicked on the radio, hoping to break the tension, but instead of music, the speakers emitted a low, distorted hum. They twisted the dial, searching for a clear station, but the noise only grew louder, more garbled. Frustrated, they turned it off, but the hum lingered faintly, as if it had seeped into the air. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the streetlights becoming fewer and farther between. The meter on the dashboard suddenly reset to 0, the faint ticking noise it had been making falling silent. The driver frowned, tapping the display. "That's strange," they muttered, more to themselves than the passenger. "What's strange?" the passenger asked, their voice startlingly close. The driver flinched, glancing in the rearview mirror. The passenger hadn't moved, but their hood had shifted slightly, revealing the edge of a pale, shadowed face. Their head was tilted ever so slightly, as if they were watching the driver. A chill ran down the driver's spine. Nothing," the driver stammered, turning their eyes back to the road. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. The driver tapped their fingers nervously on the wheel, their gaze flicking between the road and the mirror. When they looked up, they froze. The landscape outside had changed. The trees lining the road were gone, replaced by a barren expanse of dark, featureless land. "Where are we?" the driver asked, their voice cracking slightly. "You're taking me there," the passenger said, their tone eerily calm. The driver's stomach twisted, and their grip tightened on the wheel. "Taking you where?" The passenger didn't respond. Instead, they leaned back into the shadows, their face vanishing again beneath the hood. The driver's pulse quickened, their heart thudding in their chest. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. They wanted to pull over, to demand answers, but the thought of stopping, of confronting this strange, silent passenger filled them with dread. So they did the only thing they could. They kept driving, deeper into the darkness. The road seemed endless, a winding ribbon of asphalt that stretched into nothingness. The once familiar landmarks had vanished, replaced by a desolate expanse of darkness. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened as their unease grew. They glanced again in the rearview mirror, but the passenger was as still as ever, their hood shrouding their face in shadows. The air inside the taxi grew colder, sharp enough to make the driver's breath visible. They reached for the temperature dial, twisting it all the way to warm, but the chill refused to leave. The dashboard lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the car's interior into a dim, eerie glow lit only by the headlights. "You need to tell me where we're going," the driver said, trying to sound firm, but failing to mask the tremor in their voice. The passenger leaned forward slightly, their head tilting to one side. "Not much farther," they said, their voice softer now, almost a whisper. The driver felt the hair on the back of their neck stand on end. "Farther to what? Where are we even going?" The passenger didn't answer. Instead, they began humming softly, a low, haunting tune that seemed to echo in the confined space of the taxi. It wasn't a melody the driver recognized, and yet it felt disturbingly familiar, like something they'd heard long ago in a nightmare they couldn't quite remember. The driver's stomach churned. Their gaze darted to the rearview mirror, and for the first time, they noticed something impossible. The passenger's reflection wasn't there. The back seat was empty in the mirror, but when the driver glanced over their shoulder, the passenger was still sitting there, perfectly still, their head bowed. Panic surged in the driver's chest, but they forced themselves to look forward. "Just keep driving," they told themselves. "Get through this, and it'll be fine." But it wasn't fine. The headlights ahead flickered, revealing something standing in the middle of the road. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, watching them. The driver slammed the brakes, but when the car came to a screeching halt, there was nothing there. The road was empty again, stretching endlessly into the void. "Did you see that?" the driver asked, their voice shaky. "Yes," the passenger replied simply. The driver's fingers trembled on the wheel. What was it?" The passenger leaned forward slowly, their voice low and menacing. "You don't want to know." The hum from before returned, louder now, filling the car with an unbearable vibration. The driver winced, their head pounding. They glanced in the mirror one more time, hoping for some sign of normalcy, but instead, they saw the passenger's face, or what should have been their face. There was nothing, no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale void staring back at them. The driver gasped, their hands gripping the wheel so tightly that their knuckles turned white. What are you?" The passenger leaned back into the shadows, the humming growing louder. "Keep driving," they said, their voice echoing unnaturally. "You'll find out soon enough." The driver's heart pounded in their chest, and they realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't in control anymore. The road stretched on, endless and empty, and there was no turning back. The road ahead seemed to shift and twist, no longer behaving like a normal highway. The lines on the asphalt blurred and melted into the darkness, the headlights struggling to illuminate anything beyond a few feet. The driver's breathing was ragged now, each shallow inhale feeling like it carried the weight of dread. "I'm done with this," the driver muttered, their voice trembling. "I'm stopping the car." The passenger leaned forward again, their presence suffocating. "You can't stop," they said, their voice no longer soft but sharp and commanding. "Not yet." The driver ignored them, their hands jerking the wheel toward the shoulder. But the road didn't end. No matter how far they turned, the car stayed on the same path as if the wheels were locked onto invisible rails. The driver slammed the brakes, desperate to regain control, but the car didn't slow. It continued forward, steady and unyielding. "What's happening?" the driver shouted, panic overtaking their voice. "What do you want from me?" The passenger sat back, their hood falling away to reveal their face, or the absence of it. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface, glowing faintly in the dim light. "You've already taken the first step," they said, their voice echoing unnaturally. "Now you'll finish the journey." The humming sound from before returned, louder and more intense, vibrating through the car. The driver screamed, gripping the wheel as the surroundings began to change. The darkness outside the car grew deeper, swallowing the landscape entirely. The air inside became freezing cold, the windows frosting over in an instant. Ahead, the road ended abruptly, giving way to a vast, empty void. The driver tried to stop the car again, their feet stomping on the brake and clutch, but the vehicle didn't respond. It surged forward, drawn to the edge like a moth to a flame. "No, no, no," the driver shouted, their voice cracking. They turned in their seat to face the passenger, their face pale and desperate. "What is this? Please, just let me go." The passenger tilted their head slightly, as if considering the plea. Then they raised a hand and pointed forward. "This is where you belong now," they said simply. The car reached the edge, and for a moment, everything was silent. The vehicle hovered on the brink, the void stretching infinitely below. The driver's mind raced, but there was no time to react. In the next instant, the car plunged forward, falling into the darkness. The driver's scream was swallowed by the void, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sensation. And then, the humming returned, faint and distant. The driver's eyes fluttered open, their heart pounding in their chest. They were back in the car, the road stretching ahead of them as if nothing had happened. But they weren't alone. The passenger was still in the back seat, their face once again hidden beneath the shadow of the hood. "Keep driving," they said, their voice calm and emotionless. "It's not over yet." The driver's hands trembled as they gripped the wheel, realizing with dawning horror that the journey had only just begun. The car rolled forward, the hum of the engine blending with the oppressive silence of the endless road. The driver's hands shook as they clung to the wheel, their knuckles white, their mind racing. The passenger sat still in the back seat, their hood once again hiding their face. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the reach of the dim headlights. The driver's voice cracked as they finally broke the silence. "Why me? What do you want from me?" The passenger leaned forward slightly, their presence heavy and suffocating. "You're the one who picked me up," they said simply, as if that explained everything. Tears welled in the driver's eyes. I didn't know what you were." "You didn't need to," the passenger replied, their tone calm but chilling. "You're here now, and there's no turning back." The road ahead began to twist again, the lines on the asphalt distorting and stretching into impossible shapes. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, the driver thought they saw movement outside the car, shadowy figures flitting just beyond the light. They tried to focus, but the more they looked, the harder it became to tell where the road ended and the darkness began. The car slowed suddenly, though the driver hadn't touched the brakes. The engine sputtered, and the vehicle came to a stop in the middle of the road. The driver's breath hitched. The silence was deafening now, even the faint hum of the car gone. "Why are we stopping?" the driver whispered, their voice trembling. The passenger didn't answer. Instead, they opened the back door and stepped out, their movement slow and deliberate. The driver watched, frozen, as the passenger stood by the side of the road, their silhouette framed against the void. They raised a hand, motioning for the driver to follow. "No," the driver said, shaking their head. "I'm not getting out." The passenger turned slowly, and for the first time, the driver saw their face fully illuminated. It was featureless, smooth and pale, with faint, swirling patterns etched into the surface like whispers of something ancient. When they spoke, their voice came from everywhere at once. "You've been chosen," they said. "It's time." The driver felt a force pulling at them, invisible but impossibly strong. The door locks clicked open on their own, and the car's interior lights flickered ominously. The driver grabbed the wheel, clinging to it as if it could anchor them to safety. "No!" they screamed, their voice raw with terror. "I'm not going anywhere with you!" But the force grew stronger, and the driver's grip slipped. They were pulled from the car, their screams echoing into the darkness. The passenger stood still, watching as the driver disappeared into the void. The car remained where it was, its engine silent, the door still ajar. For a moment, all was still. Then the passenger climbed back into the back seat, their hood drawn low once again. The car's engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness as it began to move. But this time, there was no driver. The taxi continued down the endless road, its back seat waiting patiently for the next unwitting passenger to flag it down.